The warrant weighed more in my hand than the iron key beside it, and I have carried men off battlefields lighter than that single sheet of paper. We stood 3 abreast in the west corridor of Harrowgate Palace, outside a door that had no name on the household plan. Not the consort's dressing room, which lay 2 doors down and was known to every laundress in the palace. Not the linen store. This door was newer than the wall around it, its hinges oiled to silence, its lock the kind a locksmith fits for a strongbox and not for a wardrobe. For 11 months it had stayed shut to everyone but Queen Consort Morwenna and the one maid she trusted, and in those 11 months I had walked past it perhaps 1,000 times on my rounds and told myself it was none of my concern. It had become my concern. The Lord Steward's seal at the foot of the warrant said so, in red wax pressed with the crossed keys of the household, and under it his own hand. By lawful authority of the king, the sealed chamber in the consort's west apartment is to be opened, and its contents inventoried in the presence of 2 officers of the guard and the clerk of the wardrobe. Nothing to be removed, everything to be recorded. My name is Corran Vale. At the time of these events, I had served 19 years in the household guard of the Kingdom of Eldermore, the last 6 of them as a sergeant-at-arms with the run of the private wings, which is a polite way of saying I was trusted with the doors that mattered and expected never to ask what lay behind them. A guard's whole trade is stillness. We are taught it the way other men are taught a language, until the not moving and the not speaking and the not tasking become the shape of the mind itself. I was good at it. I had stood at a coronation and a state funeral and a christening, and never so much as shifted my weight in a way a watching eye could catch. So understand what it cost me, that morning, to lift the key. Beside me stood Guardsman Bex Harrow, younger than me by 12 years and steadier than most men twice his age, and on my other side the clerk of the wardrobe, a narrow, ink-stained man named Perrin Coyle, who held his great inventory book against his chest like a shield. Coyle's hands were not steady. He had spent 30 years counting the crown's linens and gowns and coronets, entering each one in his beautiful cramped script, and now he had been marched to a door he had never been permitted to open and told to write down what he found. His whole life's work was accuracy, and he plainly suspected that whatever waited on the other side would prove his books had been lied to for a year. "Sergeant," he said and stopped. "Say it, Master Coyle. If what I think is in there is in there." He wet his lips. "Men lose their places for less than being in the room when a thing like this comes out, even the right men, even the honest ones." "Then it's fortunate," I said, "that the warrant put our names on it and not our choices." I fitted the key. It turned without a sound, the way an expensive lock does, and the well-oiled bolt drew back, and the door that had kept its secret for 11 months swung inward on a darkness that smelled of cedar and old rose and something colder underneath, something I knew and could not yet name. I will not tell you what we found there. Not yet. If I hand you the ending now, you will not understand the weight of it, and the weight is the whole of the story. So let me take you back to the beginning, to the first small wrongness that a stiller, wiser man than I would have noticed months before I did. Let me take you back to the winter the old queen died. Queen Mother Rosalind had been the mother of our king, Alaric, and the widow of the king before him, and in the reckoning of the common people she had been something larger than either. A fixed star, the last living memory of an Eldermore that the young could not remember and the old were afraid of losing. She had been queen for 40 years and queen mother for 15 more, and in all that time I never once heard a servant curse her name, which if you have ever worked in a great house you will know is a kind of miracle. Servants curse everyone. They cursed the king on his short-tempered days and the consort every day of the week. But of Rosalind they spoke the way you speak of a grandmother who has died, gently and with a catch in the voice. I had reason of my own. 12 years before, when I was a raw guardsman on my first winter of night watches, I had fallen ill at my post, a fever I had hidden because a new man does not report sick, and I had swayed and gone down on one knee in the long gallery at 2 in the morning, certain I had just ended my career. It was Rosalind who found me. She was old even then, and could not sleep and walked the galleries at night with a single candle, and she came upon a boy in a red tunic kneeling on the cold marble trying not to be sick, and she did not call the watch officer to have me disciplined. She sat down on the gallery bench, an old woman in a plain gray wrap, and she talked to me quietly about nothing at all until the fever sweat passed, and then she sent me to the kitchens for hot broth with a word to the cook that would keep me out of trouble, and she never spoke of it again. Not to me, not to anyone. For 12 years I had carried that debt the way a man carries a coin he will not spend. I would have stood in front of a blade for her. She died in the deep of that winter, in her own bed, in her sleep, at the great age of 81, and the whole kingdom went into mourning. And for 3 days the bells of Harrowgate tolled once for every year of her life at the setting of the sun. I stood in the honor guard at her lying-in state and watched 10,000 people file past the catafalque in the cathedral, farmers and fishwives and old soldiers, many of them weeping, and I thought that whatever came after her, we would not see her like again. What came after her was the settling of her estate, and that is where the wrongness began, though it was so quiet at first that I mistook it for grief. A great person leaves a great tangle behind them. Rosalind had rooms of her own in the east wing that had been hers for 50 years, crowded with the accumulation of a long life. Her clothes, her books, her jewels, her letters, the small things a person gathers that mean nothing to a stranger and everything to the one who owned them. All of it had to be sorted, catalogued, and disposed of according to her will, which she had made years before with the care of a woman who did not intend to leave a mess. Everything was accounted for. Everything had a destination. Her state jewels to the crown, to be worn by the queens who came after her. Her private jewels divided among her granddaughters and her lady companions with a note in her own hand for each. Her books to the royal library. Her letters, some to the archive and some to the fire, exactly as she directed. Her gowns, and she had kept the great gowns of her life, the coronation robe, the gown she wore at her silver jubilee, the mourning she wore for her husband, those to be preserved in the royal wardrobe as garments of state, the property of the crown forever, the physical memory of a reign. Corran Vale was the man charged with receiving the wardrobe's share into his inventory, and it was Corran Vale, though I did not know it then, who first felt the floor shift. I learned of it slowly, in the way a man on a post learns everything, a word here, a look there, the traffic of the corridors. Rosalind's rooms had passed, in the reshuffling that death brings to a palace, into the keeping of the Queen Consort. Morwenna had wanted the east wing for years. Its rooms were the finest in the palace, its windows caught the morning, and to hold them was to hold a kind of precedence. She had married King Alaric 4 years before, a second marriage for him after the long grief of losing his first wife, the Queen Isolde, and Morwenna had come to the crown late and hungry, with 2 grown children of her own from an earlier marriage, and a determination that the world should never again treat her as anything less than a queen. That is not a crime. A great many people are ambitious, but ambition in a small soul curdles, and Morwenna's had curdled early. She took the east wing within a month of the funeral, and it was after that, Coyle told me much later, that the numbers stopped agreeing. The first I knew of any of it with my own eyes was on an ordinary afternoon in the spring, when the morning bands had come off and the palace had gone back to its business. I was walking the west corridor, my usual round, and I passed the new door, the sealed door, though it was not yet sealed then, only kept, as a maid came out of it. I knew the maid. Her name was Nella, and she had been one of the late Queen Mother's own girls, a quiet, dutiful creature of perhaps 20 who had wept at the lying-in state harder than anyone. After the funeral she had been kept on in the household and given, I understood, to the consort's service. She came out of that door with a bundle in her arms wrapped in a dust sheet, and when she saw me she startled so badly that she nearly dropped it, and the sheet slipped, and for 1/2 of 1 second I saw what she was carrying. It was a gown, deep blue, the blue of a night sky, worked all over with silver thread in a pattern of little stars, and I knew it the way you know a face. It was the gown Rosalind had worn to her silver jubilee. I had stood in the honor guard that day, a young man in the sun, and I had watched the old queen come down the cathedral steps in that gown with the light catching every silver star, and the whole city had roared for her. There was not another gown like it in the world. It was one of the great gowns, a garment of state, the property of the crown, and by the terms of the will it belonged in Perrin Coyle's inventory in the royal wardrobe under lock and seal. It was in a dust sheet, in a maid's arms coming out of the Queen Consort's private room. Nella caught the sheet up and mumbled something, begging your pardon, Sergeant, and hurried past me with her head down and her ears scarlet, and I stood there and let her go, because a sergeant of the guard does not stop a maid on the consort's business and demand to know what she carries. That is not my place. I told myself I had seen a gown being taken to be cleaned, or aired, or repaired. There are 100 honest reasons for a gown to be carried down a corridor. I told myself all of them. But I had spent 19 years learning to read the small language of faces, because a man whose whole job is to watch a corridor learns to tell the difference between a servant on an errand and a servant carrying a secret, and Nella's face had not been the face of a girl airing a gown. It had been the face of a girl caught, and a garment of state does not go out to be cleaned wrapped in a dust sheet in the arms of a single maid, by a private door, with no docket and no clerk. It goes in a case trolley with 2 footmen and a signed order. Everything the crown owns moves on paper. That is the first thing you learn about a palace. Nothing of value moves without a witness and a signature, precisely so that no one can ever say afterward, I don't know where it went. That gown had moved without either, and it had come out of a door that Morwenna kept locked. I did nothing. I want to be honest with you about that, because I have heard men tell the stories of their own courage and leave out the long stretch in the middle where they did nothing at all. I did nothing for weeks. I told myself it was not my concern, that I had seen a fragment of a thing I did not understand, that to carry a tale about the Queen Consort on the strength of a half-second glimpse of a dust sheet would be the act of a fool and a troublemaker, and that men of my rank who make trouble for queens do not keep their posts long enough to be proven right. All of that was true, and under all of it, quiet and shaming, was the plain animal fact that I was afraid. Morwenna was not a woman who forgave. So I filed it away, the way a guard files everything, in the part of the mind that keeps watch while the rest of you goes about your day. And I would perhaps have kept it filed forever if the old dresser had not come to find me. Her name was Mistress Halloran, and she had dressed the late Queen Mother for 32 years. She was a small, upright woman of near 70 with a face like a closed drawer, and she had been the sort of servant who is more a fixture of the crown than the people who wear it. She had come to Rosalind as a young seamstress and grown old at her side, and she had a seamstress's eyes, which is to say she could tell you the count of the thread in a cuff at a glance, and would notice a missing button from across a hall. When the Queen Mother died, Mistress Halloran had been pensioned with honor and given rooms in the palace to end her days in, and everyone assumed she would fade quietly into the wallpaper. Everyone was wrong. She came to me on a wet evening at the end of my watch, waiting in the shadow of a pillar in the lower gallery until the corridor was empty, which told me before she spoke a word that whatever she had to say she had thought hard about saying. Your veil, she said. The sergeant, you stood at her lying-in state, I saw you. I did, mistress. You didn't fidget. She said it as though it were the highest praise she knew, and perhaps for her it was. 3 days and you didn't fidget. A man who can be still that long can keep his mouth shut. I need a man who can keep his mouth shut and still hear what I'm telling him. She looked up and down the empty gallery. They're taking her things. I should have played the fool. It would have been safer. Instead, I heard myself say quietly, Who is mistress? Who do you think? Her mouth thinned. I helped catalog them, It was the last thing I did for her. I asked to, and they let me, an old woman who knew every stitch she owned. I stood in that east wing for a month, and I laid out every gown and every glove and every jewel, and I checked them against Master Coil's book and against her own list, and I signed for them. Every piece. I know exactly what she left and exactly where each piece was meant to go, because I helped write it down. She leaned closer and her voice dropped to almost nothing. And now the pieces are walking. A gown here, a case of jewels there. The little things first that a body might not miss. Then bigger. The blue Jubilee gown when a fortnight passed. I know because I went to look at it in the room where they'd stored the state gowns, and it was gone off its stand. And the stand was pushed to the back so the gap wouldn't show. And when I asked the underkeeper, he told me it had been sent for cleaning. Garments of state are not sent for cleaning by a girl with a dust sheet, Sergeant. They are cased and carded and signed for. You know that as well as I do. I did know it. I had known it for weeks and told myself I didn't. Hearing it from her, in her flat, certain seamstress's voice, was like having a splinter you had been pretending, was nothing suddenly named as a splinter. "Have you spoken to the clerk of the wardrobe?" I asked. "Coil," she almost laughed. "Coil knows. Coil has known for months, poor rabbit, and he's frightened out of his wits, because his book says one thing and his shelves say another and he can't make them agree, and every time he raises it he's told the difference is with the consort's household on the consort's authority and to leave off. He's a clerk. He counts. He hasn't the standing to knock on a queen's door and ask her to account for a gown, and neither have I, and neither, if you'll forgive me, have you. But someone does. And that someone will need more than an old woman's word, and a frightened clerk's crossed-out figures. They'll need it laid out so plain that not even a queen can talk her way around it." She fixed me with a look that had dressed the mightiest woman in the kingdom for 32 years and was not now going to be put off by a sergeant. "You have the run of the private wings. You see the doors. You see who comes and goes. I'm asking you to watch. Just watch and remember, and when the day comes that someone with the standing to act asks the question, be the man who can answer it." I have thought a great deal since about why I said yes. It was not courage, or not only, it was the debt. I stood in that wet gallery, and I saw an old woman on a cold marble bench 12 years before, an old woman who could have had me disciplined and instead sent me for broth, and I understood that the account had come due at last, and that the only coin that would settle it was the one thing a guard is trained never to spend: attention turned where it is not wanted. "I'll watch," I said. And I did. Watching, it turned out, was its own kind of discipline, harder than standing still. I began to keep a book of my own, not a written one, that would have been madness, but a book in the head, the kind a sentry keeps of every face that passes a gate. I noted the door. I noted who went in and who came out and at what hours, and I found that the traffic through that sealed room ran to a pattern. Nella the maid, at odd times, always with something under a sheet, always by the private stair that avoided the main corridors. The consort herself, most evenings alone. And once a week or so, a man I did not at first know, a smooth, well-dressed fellow of middle years with a jeweler's loop on a ribbon and a leather case, who came in by the tradesman's route with a footman's escort and was taken up the private stair, and who stayed an hour and left with his case looking heavier or lighter, and about whom the household books, when I later contrived to see them, said nothing at all. No name, no appointment, no docket, a man who was not there. I noted the jewels. This took longer because I am a soldier and not a lapidary, and one bright stone looks much like another to me. But I had Mistress Halloran, and Mistress Halloran had 32 years of the late Queen's jewel cases in her head, and between us we built a thing I could carry. She described the pieces to me one by one on the evenings she found me alone, not the state jewels, which were locked away and hard to move, but the private ones, the pieces Rosalind had worn every day and loved and willed to her granddaughters. A brooch of 3 sapphires set as forget-me-nots, a rope of gray pearls with a diamond clasp shaped like a true lover's knot, a ring with a single deep blue stone that Rosalind had called her evening star, and had worn on her right hand for 50 years. That was to go, by the will, to the king's own daughter. No, I misspeak. The king had no daughter by his first marriage, but there was the Princess Alara, his niece by his sister, whom Rosalind had loved as a granddaughter, and it was to Alara that the evening star ring was left. I began to see the pieces. Not on Nella and not carried openly. Morwenna was cleverer than that. But at a reception in the Long Gallery, 6 weeks after Mistress Halloran first spoke to me, I stood my post along the wall and watched the Queen Consort move among her guests, and on the breast of her gown, catching the candlelight, were 3 sapphires set as forget-me-nots. I knew the brooch before I had finished deciding to look at it. And a fortnight after that, at a smaller supper, there were the gray pearls at her throat with the true lover's knot at the front, and she touched them once lightly, the way a woman touches a thing she is proud to be seen in, and I stood 4 feet from her with my face turned to stone and thought, those belong to the Princess Adela's daughter, and you know it, and you are wearing them at your own table as if the dead cannot see. I said nothing. It was not the day. Mistress Halloran had been right about that too. A sergeant does not accuse a queen of theft across a supper table, and if he tries, he is the one who is removed quietly by nightfall, and the pearls stay exactly where they are. I needed the day when someone with standing asked the question, and I began, slowly, to see how I might help that day arrive. The someone, when I found the courage to approach her, was the Princess Adela. She was the king's younger sister, a widow of perhaps 50, and she was the one person in the whole vast machine of the palace whom Morwenna could neither charm nor frighten. Adela had grown up in that court. She had watched 3 consorts come and go. She had a dry, unhurried way about her and a memory like a ledger, and she had loved the old Queen Mother, her own mother, with a fierce private devotion that she wore like plain clothes. If anyone would hear an ugly thing and not flinch from it, it was Adela. But you do not simply walk up to a princess of the blood and tell her that the Queen Consort is a thief. I needed a door, and it was Mistress Halloran in the end who opened it, because Mistress Halloran had dressed the princess as a girl and could send word to her that an old servant begged a private word. The 3 of us met in the Princess Adela's own sitting room on a gray afternoon, with the door shut and a maid the princess trusted keeping the corridor. And there, at last, I said it aloud. I laid it out the way Mistress Halloran had taught me to want it laid, plainly. The sealed room, the private stair, Nella and the dust sheets, the jubilee gown that had walked, the nameless man with the loop and the case who came and went and left no docket, the forget-me-not brooch on the consort's breast and the true lover's pearls at her throat, both of them willed by the late Queen Mother's own hand to other women. I did not embroider it. I did not accuse. I told her what I had seen and let the seeing do its work, and I watched the Princess Adela's face go from patient courtesy to a stillness that was colder and older than any I had ever managed on a post. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You understand," she said at last, "what you are telling me, and what it will mean if you are wrong." "I understand it better than anyone in this room, Highness. It's my neck first." "Yes," she almost smiled without warmth. "It is." She rose and went to the window and stood with her back to us, looking down into the gray courtyard, and when she spoke again it was half to herself. "My mother made her will with her own hand. She read me pieces of it the year before she died, not the money. She never cared for the money but the things. The ring, for Alara, the pearls for my Surreys. She wanted each of us to have the thing she'd worn when we were children so that we'd remember her hands and not her crown." She turned around, and her face had settled into something I recognized, because I had seen it on the faces of officers the moment before a decision that cannot be unmade. She trusted the household to carry out her wishes. And the household has been carrying them into that woman's locked room instead. "Highness," I said carefully, "an old woman's memory and a sergeant's eyes will not be enough. The consort will say the pieces were gifts. She'll say the Queen Mother gave them to her freely before she died, and there's no one living to say otherwise, and a queen's word against a servant's is no contest at all." "No," Adela agreed, "it is not." And then she said the thing that turned everything, the thing that made the rest of it possible. "But my mother did not trust to memory. My mother wrote everything down, and I know where her own book is." The book was a small, thick, plain thing bound in worn brown leather, and it had been Rosalind's private inventory for the last 30 years of her life. Not the Crown's ledger, that was Coil's great tome, official and public. This was the old Queen's own. A woman who has been given more jewels in a lifetime than she can wear in 10 develops, if she is wise and orderly, a habit of writing down what she has and where it came from and where it is to go, and Rosalind had been the wisest and most orderly woman I ever heard of. In her own upright hand, growing shakier toward the last pages, she had listed every private piece she owned, what it was, who had given it to her, what it was worth to her heart if not to a jeweler, and in a separate column added in her final years, when she had begun to set her affairs in order, the name of the person it was to pass to when she was gone. The forget-me-not brooch, to my dear Verena, *no. I read that entry 3 times before I understood it, and its meaning did not become clear until much later, so let me leave it for now and tell it in its place. The gray pearls, to Ceres that she may remember I danced. The evening star ring, to Alara my brightest girl. Every piece I had seen on Morwenna's breast, and at Morwenna's throat was in that book, in the dead queen's own hand, assigned to another woman. Adela had kept the book. It had been given to her, quietly, by the Queen Mother's confessor after the funeral, with a word that the old queen had wished her daughter to have it. Not the executors, not the household, her daughter, and Adela had put it in a locked drawer and grieved, and not looked at it for months, because to read her mother's handwriting was more than she could bear. She had not connected it, until I stood in her sitting room, to the walking gowns and the wandering jewels. Now she took it out and laid it on the table between us, and the 3 of us bent over it in the gray light, and I watched an old dresser and a princess turn the pages of a dead woman's heart and match it, line by line, to what had gone missing. It was all there. That was the thing that made my own hands cold. It was not a matter of one gown or one brooch that might be explained away. Piece by piece, across 30 pages, the late Queen Mother had said plainly what she owned and where it was to go, and piece by piece those things had been carried into a locked room in the west apartment of the woman who now called herself Queen. A room that, by the will and by the Crown's own inventory, had no business holding a single one of them. "This," Adela said, and her finger rested on the page, "is proof of what she wanted. It is not yet proof of what was taken. For that," she closed the book, "we would have to open that door, and to open that door I would need the king." There was the difficulty, and it was a real one. King Alaric was my liege, and I will speak of him with respect, but I will speak of him truly, and the truth is that in that season he was a grieving, tired, and somewhat blinded man. He had lost his mother, and 4 years before that, his first wife, the Queen Isolde, whom he had loved past all reason, and into the great cold space those 2 women left he had let Morwenna come, and Morwenna had made herself indispensable to him in the way that a certain kind of person makes themselves indispensable, by managing everything, by being always at his elbow, by turning every question that reached him through the filter of her own judgment first. He was not a foolish man. But a man who is grieving does not want to hear that the woman keeping his household running smoothly is robbing the memory of his mother, and Morwenna knew it, and she had spent 4 years making sure that any ill word about her reached the king already softened, or already answered, or not at all. "He will not want to believe it," I said. "He will not," Adela agreed, "which is why we will not ask him to believe anything. We will ask him only to permit a lawful inventory of a sealed room in his own house, a thing any steward may request and any king may grant without accusing anyone of anything, and we will let what is behind the door do the accusing." It was well thought. It was, in fact, exactly right. And it very nearly did not happen, because Morwenna was cleverer and quicker than any of us. And before we could bring our quiet, careful case to the king, she moved against me. I should have expected it. A woman who has spent months walking treasures into a locked room does not do so blindly. She watches the corridors as carefully as I did, and I had grown, over those weeks, less invisible than a sergeant ought to be. I had been seen speaking to Mistress Halloran. I had been seen, once, leaving the Princess Adela's wing at an hour when a guard has no reason to be there. Morwenna did not know what I knew. But she knew I was a thread that had begun to pull, and her answer to a pulling thread was to cut it. It came dressed as an honor, which is how the cleverest cruelties always come. On a Tuesday I was informed by my captain, an honest man who plainly disliked his own orders, that I was to be transferred, effective at the week's end, to the border garrison at Ravensmere, a full 200 miles from Harrowgate, to take up a post as sergeant instructor to the recruits. It was a promotion in everything but truth. More pay, more men under me, a warm billet and a quiet life. And it would put me 200 miles from the sealed door, from Mistress Halloran, from the Princess Adela, from any chance of being the man who could answer the question when the day came. And it would do it in a way that no one could object to, because who objects to a good man being promoted? Whose hand is behind it? I asked my captain. He looked at me for a long moment. The recommendation, he said carefully, came down through the consort's household, as a mark of her particular regard for your years of service. And then, because he was an honest man and could not quite stomach it, he added lower, "You've a week, Vale. If there's anything a man might want to finish in a week, I'd finish it." I went to Mistress Halloran that same evening, and I have never seen an old woman look at once so frightened and so fierce. "A week," she said. "She's giving us a week to lose our nerve, that's what it is. She'll move the rest of it in that week, the big pieces, the things she couldn't shift while there were eyes to see, and by the time you're gone the room will be half empty and clean, and Coyle's crossed-out book will be the only evidence left, and Coyle will be told to fix his figures and be glad of his place." Her hands, folded on her lap, were shaking, and she stilled them by main force. "It has to be now, this week, before you're carted off to the ends of the earth. We take the book to the princess, and the princess takes it to the king, and the door is opened while there is still something behind it worth finding, or it never happens at all. The princess said the king will not want to believe it. Then the princess must not give him the choice." Mistress Halloran leaned forward. "Sergeant, I dressed that woman upstairs when she first came to this court, before she was queen of anything, before she'd learned to smooth her voice. I know what she is. She is not brave. She is only bold when she thinks no one is looking. The instant a lawful hand is laid on that door, the instant it is a matter of the king's own warrant and the king's own officers and a clerk with a book, she will fold, because a woman like that has no floor under her. It is all front. Give her a real wall to push against and she has nothing. But you must give her the wall this week, or she'll have you 200 miles gone and the evidence in the fire." I went to the Princess Adela the next morning and told her of the transfer, and she understood its meaning before I had finished the sentence. She was quiet for a moment, and then she did a thing I did not expect. She smiled, a small, grim, satisfied smile, like a chess player who has just watched an opponent make the one move that loses. "She is frightened," Adela said. "Do you see it? She would not reach out to move you unless she were frightened, and she would not be frightened unless there were something behind that door worth being frightened about. My brother might have doubted an old woman and a sergeant. He will find it much harder to doubt an old woman, a sergeant, our mother's own inventory book, and the Queen Consort suddenly, urgently, arranging to send the sergeant to the far side of the kingdom the very week the questions began. She has handed us the one thing we lacked. She has made herself look guilty." She stood, and the last of the patient sister fell away from her, and what was left was a daughter of 40 years of kings. "I will see my brother tonight." I was not in the room when the Princess Adela saw the king, and so I will not pretend to give you their words. but I know what came of it, because I lived the next 2 days inside the wake of it, and I have since heard the shape of that conversation from Adela herself. She did not, she told me, begin with the theft. She began with their mother. She sat with her brother in his private study, the two of them alone, and she laid the small brown book on the desk between them and asked him if he knew what it was. And when he opened it and saw their mother's hand, the upright letters going shaky at the last, he was quiet for a long time, and something in him that had been clenched since the winter of the funeral loosened and grieved. Adela let him grieve. And then, gently, without heat, she turned the pages and showed him the entries, and beside each one she named the piece and where it now was. On the consort's breast, at the consort's throat, behind the consort's locked door. She did not accuse. She showed him his mother's wishes in his mother's hand, and then she showed him where those wishes had gone, and she let the king's own eyes do to him what no accusation could have done. He did not want to believe it. Adela said he stood up and walked the length of the study twice, and told her she must be mistaken, that Morwenna managed the household, that of course some of the old queen's things had passed through her hands in the sorting, that this was grief making shadows. And Adela let him say all of it, and when he had run down she asked him one question, the only one that mattered. "If it is nothing, brother," she said, "then let the room be opened, and the pieces counted, and every one of them found to be exactly where it should be, and I will beg her pardon on my knees and never speak of it again. But if it is nothing, why has she arranged, this very week, to send 200 miles away the one guardsman who noticed the door?" And the king, who was tired and grieving and blinded, but was not in the end a fool, had no answer to that. And he sent for the Lord Steward, and he ordered the warrant drawn. But a warrant is a slow thing, and a frightened queen is fast, and in the day and a half between the king's order and the turning of the key, Morwenna very nearly won after all. She learned of the warrant almost as soon as it was drawn. She had ears in the steward's office as she had ears everywhere, and by the following morning she knew that her locked room was to be opened by the king's own command, and she did what a cornered person of her sort always does. She went to the king himself, before we could, and she wept. I had the account of it later from a footman who had stood the door, and from Adela, who was sent for part way through, and arrived to find the thing already half spun. Morwenna had gone to the king's study in the early morning with her hair undressed and her eyes red, the very picture of a wounded wife, and she had asked him, not angrily, that would have been the wrong note, and she never played the wrong note. She had asked him, brokenly, how he could let his own sister poison him against her, how it wounded her that after 4 years of devotion a locked door could be made to mean she was a thief. The room, she said, was her private grief room. She had taken some few of the dear Queen Mother's things into it. Yes, how could she deny it? She had loved Rosalind as her own mother, but only to keep them safe, to sit with them, to mourn, because the household had been so cold and careless in the sorting, and she could not bear to see the old queen's treasures handled like inventory. Everything in that room, she said, had been a gift. Rosalind had pressed her own dear pieces upon her in those last months, one by one, as a mother gives her daughter keepsakes, and there was no one living who could say otherwise, because those had been private moments between two women who loved each other, and now her husband's own sister would drag those tender gifts into the light and call them stolen, and shame her before the whole court. It was very good. I want you to understand that it was very good, because it is easy, knowing how it ended, to imagine that her lies were clumsy. They were not. She wept in exactly the right measure. She gave the king a story that let him keep believing what he wanted to believe, that his wife was loyal and his grief was ordinary, and she asked him in the end for one small mercy. Not to cancel the warrant, no, she was too clever to demand that and look as though she had something to hide. She asked only that the opening be delayed. A week, 10 days, time for her to compose herself, time for the raw wound of the accusation to settle, time, though she did not say this part, for a private room to be quietly emptied and cleaned and made to tell no tales. And the king, God help him, wavered. He was a man who wanted peace in his house more than he wanted almost anything, and here was his wife weeping and his sister grim, and the easy road, the road that let him not choose, was to grant the delay. Adela told me she watched him reach for it. She watched her brother, the king, open his mouth to say very well, let it wait a week, and she knew that if he said it the room would be bare by the time we opened it, and Morwenna would walk out of the whole affair wronged and vindicated and more powerful than before, and there would never be another chance. It was Adela who stopped it, and she did it with a single sentence, and I have treasured that sentence ever since. "Brother," she said, "if these were freely given gifts, then a week's delay costs our mother's memory nothing, and if they were not, then a week's delay is precisely what a thief would beg for. There is no reading of it in which delay serves the truth. It serves only whichever of us is lying. So ask yourself which of us that is, and grant your week to her, or grant your honesty to our mother." And the king, in the silence after that, chose his mother. He denied the delay. He confirmed the warrant. He set the opening for the very next morning, and he said, "This is the part Adela repeated to me twice, because it mattered to her," he said quietly, not looking at his wife. "If the room is as innocent as you say, madam, then tomorrow morning will cost you nothing but an hour. I find I would rather lose the hour than the doubt." And Morwenna, who was far too clever to push a king who had just, for the first time in 4 years, refused her something, dried her eyes and thanked him for his fairness and withdrew, and went straight, we later learned, to try the one thing left to her. She tried to empty the room that night. She could not do it by the private stair, because from the moment the warrant was sealed the Lord Steward had, at Adela's urging, and to his lasting credit, posted a guard on the sealed door. 2 men, day and night, under written orders that nothing was to pass in or out until the appointed hour. And the men he posted, because the steward was no fool either and had heard which sergeant it was that noticed things, were Guardsman Bex, Harrow, and me. So I spent the last night before the opening standing my final watch at Harrowgate, in front of the very door that had been the center of my mind for months, with orders in my pocket that gave me, for the first time, the lawful right to refuse the Queen Consort herself. And she came. Of course she came. A little after midnight, by the private stair, with Nella behind her carrying an empty trunk and a lamp. Morwenna came down the corridor in a dark wrap with her chin high, and she found 2 guardsmen standing across her door, and she stopped. "Stand aside, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was perfectly level now. The weeping was for the king, not for me. I wished to enter my own room. "I'm sorry, madam." I did not raise my voice. I had waited a long time to be able to say the next words, and I found I did not need to enjoy them. They were their own reward. "By the king's warrant, this door is sealed until the inventory tomorrow morning. Nothing is to pass in or out, not by any hand." I looked at the empty trunk in Nella's arms and then back at the Queen Consort, and I let her see that I had looked. "Not even yours." For one moment, and I will remember it as long as I live, the perfect front cracked, and I saw underneath it exactly what Mistress Halloran had promised me was there. No floor, no wall, nothing to push against. Just a frightened woman who had built her whole grand life on the certainty that no one would ever be permitted to open her doors, standing in a cold corridor at midnight with an empty trunk and a maid and a guard who would not move, discovering that the certainty was gone. Her mouth worked. She gathered herself. She was always able to gather herself, and she said, in a voice meant to freeze me, "You will regret this, Sergeant, when I am proven wrong tomorrow and you are proven a spy." "Then it costs me nothing to keep the door tonight, madam," I said, "if I'm to be proven wrong tomorrow anyway." She had no answer to that, any more than the king had had an answer to his sister. She turned in a swirl of dark wool and went back up the private stair with Nella and the empty trunk, and Bex let out a long breath beside me, and we stood the rest of that watch in a silence that was, for the first time in months, on my side. The morning came gray and still, the way the great mornings always seem to, as if the weather itself has learned to keep a respectful quiet. They gathered a little after 9. The Lord Steward, a heavy, careful man named Lord Bramwell with the cross-key seal on a chain around his neck, come in person because a warrant of the king's is not delegated. The Princess Adela, in plain dark clothes, holding nothing, her hands folded. Her mother's book left behind now because it had done its work and the room itself would finish it. Perrin Coyle the clerk, with his great inventory tome and a fresh blank ledger for the recording. Mistress Halloran, who had asked to be present, and whom the steward, after a glance at the princess, permitted the old dresser standing very straight in her best black, there to name what a clerk's book might not know by sight. 2 more guardsmen, Bex and I, as the warrants named officers. And the Queen Consort Morwenna, who had the right to be present at the opening of her own room, and who exercised it, arriving last, composed now, immaculate, in a gown of deep gray with not a single one of the wandering jewels upon her, her face arranged into the patient, wounded dignity of a woman enduring an outrage she is too gracious to resist. The king did not come. I understood it, and I did not judge him for it. Some things a man cannot bear to watch done to his own hope, and would rather be told of after. He had given the warrant. He had refused the delay. He had done the hard thing. He could not also stand in a corridor and watch a door open on the proof that the woman he had married had been robbing his dead mother for a year. He waited in his study, and he had asked that the Princess Adela bring him the account herself, whatever it proved to be. So it fell to me. Lord Bramwell read the warrant aloud in the corridor, his voice flat and formal, the cross-key seal catching the gray light, and every ear in that hushed gathering heard the king's authority laid over the door. And when he had finished, he rolled the paper and looked at me, and said the words I had been walking toward for months without knowing it. "Sergeant Vale, you hold the key. Open the room." I looked once at Mistress Halloran, who gave me the smallest nod, be the man who can answer, and once at the Princess Adela, who did not move at all. And then I fitted the key to the strongbox lock, and it turned without a sound, and the bolt drew back, and the door that had kept its secret for 11 months swung inward on a darkness that smelled of cedar and old rose and something colder underneath. This time I did not look away, and I will tell you what we found. It was a small room, windowless, no larger than a modest bedchamber, and someone had made it beautiful. That was the first thing that struck me, and it struck me as more terrible than any squalor would have been. This was not a thief's hoard flung into a cupboard. This was a shrine, or the theft of one. Lamps were lit along the walls on low flame, kept burning even overnight, which told me the room was tended daily. The air was dry and cool and sweet with cedar, the air of a place built to preserve precious things. And around 3 of the 4 walls, on padded stands and behind glass, and in fitted cases, laid out with the loving care of a museum, were the belongings of the late Queen Mother Rosalind. The gowns first, because they were largest and I saw them first. 6 of them, on tailor's forms, ranged along the left wall like a line of standing ghosts. The deep blue of the silver jubilee worked all over with silver stars, that I had watched come down the cathedral steps in the sun 20 years before. The heavy cream and gold of her coronation robe, that by the will and the law belonged to the crown forever and should have been sealed in the state wardrobe under Coyle's hand. The soft dove gray she had worn at her husband's memorial. Beside me I heard Mistress Halloran make a sound, not a sob, she was too proud for that, but a sharp indrawn breath, the sound a person makes when they see a face they had thought never to see again, and she said, very low in the tone of a woman reading names off a monument, "The Jubilee, the coronation, the morning gray, the garden reception, her silver Jubilee opera cloak. And her voice caught once and steadied, her wedding gown. That's her wedding gown at the end. She kept it 50 years. It was to go to the museum of the house for the people to see. It was never anyone's to take. The jewels next. Along the right wall, in cases with glass lids on beds of dark velvet, laid out and labeled in a small neat hand that was not Rosalind's, Morwenna's own, I realized, or Nella's, cataloging the spoils as carefully as any clerk. The forget-me-not sapphires, the gray pearls with the true lover's knot, And in the center of the central case, alone on its own square of velvet, the ring with the single deep blue stone, the evening star, that Rosalind had worn on her right hand for 50 years and had willed to the Princess Alara, asterisk my brightest girl. There were more: a diamond spray, a bracelet of rubies like drops of blood, a locket, a rope of coral, dozens of pieces, the accumulated private treasure of a 40-year queen, every one of which I would later see matched, line by line, to an entry in the little brown book, and every one of which had been left by the dead woman's own hand to a living person who was not Morwenna. And there was more than gowns and jewels, and this was the part that told the truth of it most plainly. On a small table against the far wall, arranged like relics, were the personal things, the things that have no price at a jeweler's and are past all price to the heart. Rosalind's prayer book, worn soft at the corners, a pair of her reading spectacles, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a silver-backed hairbrush with a few white hairs still caught in the bristles, that no one had cleaned, that had been taken exactly as it sat on the dead woman's dressing table. Her seal, her personal seal, the private device she signed her letters with, that ought by rights to have been broken at her death, as a monarch's seal is always broken so that no hand can ever forge the dead. It had not been broken. It sat on the table, whole, in the Queen Consort's locked room. I have stood at a great many terrible scenes in 19 years of soldiering, and I tell you honestly that few of them turned my stomach as that quiet, cedar-sweet, lamplit little room did, because it was not greed alone. A greedy woman steals the jewels and sells them, and the thing is ugly, but it is at least simple. This was something colder. Morwenna had taken not only the treasures but the letters, the spectacles, the hairbrush, the unbroken seal. She had taken the woman. She had gathered up the whole physical memory of Rosalind, the beloved fixed star of the kingdom, and shut it in a locked room to be hers alone, to sit among in the evenings, to own. It was the theft of a person's death. For a long moment, no one in that doorway spoke. Perrin Coyle stood with his great book open and his pen unmoving, staring, his life's suspicion confirmed past his worst imagining. Lord Bramwell's heavy face had gone the color of ash, and the Princess Adela stepped past me into the room slowly and went to the far table and picked up the silver hairbrush with the white hairs still in it, and held it, and did not weep, and somehow her not weeping was the hardest thing in the room to watch. Then she turned, the brush in her hand, and looked at Morwenna, who had come to the doorway behind us all. To her credit, and I use the word the way one uses it of a duelist who does not run, Morwenna did not flinch at the door. She stood on the threshold of her open secret and looked into it with the same composed, wounded dignity she had worn all morning. And she had her story ready, because she had always had her story ready, and she spoke it into the terrible silence in a voice pitched to carry, meant not for us but for Lord Bramwell, who held the king's authority, and through him for the king. "Now you have seen it," she said, "and I hope you are ashamed. Yes, I kept her things. I loved her, and when she died and the household fell to squabbling over her estate like crows over a field, I could not bear it, and I took the pieces dearest to me into a place of quiet where I could keep them safe and mourn her properly. Every one of these she gave me. In her last months she pressed her treasures on me one by one, as a mother gives keepsakes to a daughter, the ring, the pearls, the gowns, all of it, because she trusted me above the cold executors and the grasping cousins. There is no crime here. There is only a grieving woman's shrine to the mother of her husband, and you have broken into it with soldiers and shamed me before my household. And when the king hears how his own sister used a warrant to violate my private grief, we shall see who." "She could not have given you the coronation robe," said Perrin Coyle. He said it quietly, almost to himself, and everyone turned, because the clerk of the wardrobe was not a man who spoke up, and the fact that he had spoken now was itself an event. He stood there clutching his book, pale, blinking, but he had found the one thing in 30 years of counting that he could not let pass, and he pushed on. "She could not have given it to you, madam, nor the wedding gown nor the jubilee. They are garments of state. They are the property of the crown, not of the Queen Mother's person. She did not own them to give. They were the crown's before she died and the crown's after, and the law does not permit even the Queen Mother herself to make a private gift of a garment of state, any more than she could make a gift of the throne. It is written into the settlement of the household. Any child in my office knows it. He swallowed. Whatever she gave you of her private jewels, madam, and I cannot speak to that, she did not give you those gowns because they were never hers to give. And they are here, behind your locked door, off my shelves where my book says they should be, with the stands pushed back to hide the gaps. It was a clerk's point, small and dry and technical, and it was devastating because it could not be wept away. Morwenna's story required that everything in the room be a gift, and here was the crown's own clerk stating a plain matter of law, that some of what was in the room could not have been a gift under any circumstance, that it could only have been taken. And if the gowns were taken, then the whole story of the loving deathbed keepsakes cracked straight down the middle, because a woman does not receive 6 gowns as tender gifts and steal 3 of them on the side. I watched Morwenna understand this. I watched her reach for a new story and find, for the first time all morning, that the ground she needed was not there. And into that opening the Princess Adela stepped, still holding the hairbrush, and she was not loud, and she did not weep, and she was the most frightening thing in that room. "You loved her," Adela said. "You have said it 4 times this morning. So tell me, madam, since you loved her, and she pressed all these dear things upon you with her own hands, and you sat among them these long months in grief, tell me which of us she left the evening star ring to. You will know. A woman she trusted so entirely, who received her whole heart, will surely know to whom she left her dearest ring." Morwenna's mouth opened. "I will help you," Adela went on in the same even voice. "She wrote it down. She wrote everything down. You did not know that, did you? You thought her memory died with her and left only your word against the servants. But she kept a book. Her own hand, 30 years of it, every piece named and every piece assigned. The ring you have laid on velvet in the center of that case, the evening star she wore for 50 years, she left it to the Princess Alara, my niece. She wrote beside it to Alara, my brightest girl, and the pearls at the case's edge she left to my own daughter Ceres, that she might remember her grandmother danced. Not one piece in that room, madam, not one did she leave to you." Adela let that stand a moment. "She loved a great many people, and she wrote down the loving of them, 30 pages of it, and your name is not on a single line. You did not receive her heart. You went into her rooms after she was dead, and you took it, and you locked the door." The silence after that was total. Even Coil had stopped breathing. And Morwenna, I will not pretend I felt pity, but I felt the awe one feels watching a great structure come down. Morwenna looked at the ring on the velvet, and at the hairbrush in the princess's hand, and at the unbroken seal, and at the 6 gowns standing like ghosts, and at the clerk with his damning book and the steward with the king's warrant, and the front that had held for 4 years, that had held for the king that very morning, went out of her all at once, the way the light goes out of a window. She did not confess. People like her do not confess. The word does not exist in them. But she stopped speaking, and she looked for one moment, not like a queen and not like a wounded innocent, but simply like a person who has been caught, entirely and finally caught, with no floor beneath her, exactly as an old dresser had promised me she would. "Master Coil," said Lord Bramwell, in the flat voice of a man taking refuge in procedure because the alternative is to say something he would regret, "you will begin the inventory. Name and record every piece. Sergeant Vale, Guardsman Harrow, no one enters or leaves and nothing is touched until it is recorded. Madam." He turned to Morwenna, and I saw the effort it cost him to keep his voice level. "You will withdraw to your apartments and remain there. The king will send for you." And Morwenna, who an hour before had swept in last, immaculate and gracious, the wronged queen, turned and walked out of the corridor alone, and no one bowed, and the sound of her own footsteps went ahead of her all the way down the long west hall. The inventory took the better part of the day. Perrin Coyle came into his own that afternoon, and it was a fine thing to watch. All the fear went out of him once the door was open and the thing could no longer be denied, and what was left was the craftsman. He moved through that room piece by piece with his great book and his fresh ledger, and he named everything, the gowns by their proper style and the year of their wearing, the jewels stone by stone, the letters counted and the seal noted, and the very hairbrush entered with a clerk's grave precision. *1 brush, silver-backed, personal property of the late Queen Mother, not to be cleaned pending the family's wishes. Mistress Halloran stood at his elbow through all of it and named what his book did not know. The little histories, this she wore to the harvest Thanksgiving, this was her mother's before her, and the two of them, the dry clerk and the fierce old dresser, gave the dead queen back her belongings one line at a time. I stood the door and watched, and it was the nearest thing to a service for the dead that room would ever have. It was during the inventory that the last small mystery answered itself, the one I had stumbled over in the little brown book and set aside. Among the jewels Coyle lifted a small brooch of 3 sapphires set as forget-me-nots, the very piece I had first seen on Morwenna's breast, and Adela, who had stayed through the whole long count, asked to see the book's entry for it, and Mistress Halloran read it out. The forget-me-not brooch, to my dear Verena, Morwenna's girl, she alone of that household has a gentle heart, and should have one kind thing from me to keep. The room went quiet at that, because here was the cruelest small stroke of the whole business, and it needed no accusing. Of everyone in Morwenna's family, the late Queen Mother, who owed Morwenna nothing and had watched her come grasping to the court, had reached out with her own hand to the one member of it she found gentle, the Queen Consort's own quiet daughter Verena, and had left her a keepsake, a real gift, freely given and plainly written. And Morwenna had taken even that. She had swept the brooch that was truly, lawfully, lovingly her daughter's into her locked hoard along with all she had stolen, and had worn it herself, and Verena had never known it existed. The one honest gift in that whole cedar-scented room, and the thief had stolen it from her own child. I have thought since that, if you wanted the entire shape of Morwenna in a single object, it was that brooch. The Princess Adela had it recorded separately, and set aside, and saw that it reached Verena that same week with the entry copied out in her grandmother by marriage's own words. I heard, long after, that Verena wept when she read it, and that she did not go with her mother when her mother went, and that she keeps the brooch still. Whatever seed of gentleness the old queen saw in that girl, it seems she saw it true. That is the one soft thing in this account, and I give it to you gladly, because there is little enough softness in what remains. The king sent for Morwenna that evening, and what passed between them, husband and wife, king and queen consort, no servant heard, and I will not invent it. But I saw the shape of his verdict in the days that followed, and it was the verdict of a man who had, at last and at cost, chosen his mother over his peace. She was not tried in a public court. A king does not drag the woman who shares his name through a common courtroom. The shame of that would fall on the crown itself, and Alaric had his house to think of. But there are judgments graver than a court's, and he passed them. The Queen Consort Morwenna was stripped of her household and her honors and her place at the king's side. The East Wing was taken back from her that week, and every stolen piece restored to the crown's keeping and to the heirs the old queen had named. And she herself was removed from Harrowgate, sent, under a quiet and permanent settlement, to a distant house on the cold northern edge of the kingdom, with servants enough for her comfort and walls enough that she would never trouble the court again, forbidden the capital and the king's presence for the rest of her life. It was not called a banishment in any document. Everyone called it a banishment. A woman who had schemed her way to the second highest place in the realm went north in a closed carriage in the rain, with far less than she had come with, and the gates of Harrowgate did not open for her again. Her son, Lord Cassius, read the wind. Such men always read the wind, and put a great deal of visible distance between himself and his mother's disgrace, professing shock, professing ignorance, and was allowed to keep a diminished place at court on sufferance, watched now, and knowing he was watched. The nameless man with the loup, whom I had noted coming and going with his leather case, turned out to be a valuer, a discreet fellow who assessed treasures for wealthy clients and asked no questions, and who had been quietly setting a price on the late Queen's jewels against the day Morwenna judged it safe to begin selling them abroad. He had valued but not yet sold. We had opened the door in time. He was found and dealt with and barred from every reputable house in the kingdom, and I do not think he plied that particular trade again. As for the maid, Nella, I had thought her a thief when I first saw her in the corridor with the dust sheet, and I was wrong, and I am glad I said nothing that day. She had been a frightened girl caught between her grief for a mistress she had loved and her terror of a mistress she served, ordered to carry things she knew were wrong, and too young and too poor and too alone to refuse a queen. When it all came out, she wept and told the whole of it freely, everything she had carried and when, and her testimony sealed what the room had already proved. Adela saw to it that the girl was not punished for obeying under fear, and Nella was given a place in the princess's own household, where I am told she serves faithfully to this day, and speaks of the old Queen Mother with the same catch in the voice that everyone did. The king did one more thing, and it is the reason I am able to tell you this story from close at hand, rather than from 200 miles away at a border garrison. He cancelled the transfer. The order that would have sent me to Ravensmere, that Morwenna had dressed as a promotion to get me gone, was quietly withdrawn, and in its place I was called, a sergeant-at-arms who had spent 19 years learning never to be noticed, to stand before the king himself in his private study, with the Princess Adela at his side and the little brown book on the desk between them. I will not pretend it was a grand ceremony. It was a tired man in a quiet room, and he looked at me for a while before he spoke, and I stood at attention and looked at the wall over his shoulder the way we are trained to, and at last he said, "My sister tells me that you saw the first of it months ago, a gown in a corridor, and that you carried it quietly all that time, and watched, and built the case that opened the door at the risk of your place, and had it gone otherwise your name." "I only watched, sire," I said. "Others carried the weight of it, the old dresser, the clerk, her highness. I only stood where I was standing and paid attention to what I saw." "Paying attention to what you see," the king said, "is the whole of your trade, sergeant, and most men do not do it, and fewer still do it when the seeing is dangerous." He was quiet a moment. "My mother, I am told, once sat with a sick young guardsman on a gallery bench at 2 in the morning, many years ago, and troubled herself over him when she might have had him disciplined. She never mentioned it to me. She mentioned very little of the good she did." His eyes came to mine just for a moment, and I understood that Mistress Halloran had told the princess, and the princess had told the king, and that he knew the whole of my debt. "It seems she chose well that night whom to be kind to. You have paid her back 100-fold, and you have given her back her honor besides. The crown does not forget that." He did not offer me a title. I would not have known what to do with one. He offered me the thing a soldier actually wants, which is the trust of his king and the keeping of the post that matters. I was made a senior sergeant of the private wings, with the honor of the household's most sensitive doors formally in my charge, and this was Adela's touch, and I loved her for it. I was named, in a small quiet document, one of the standing guardians of the crown's inventory, so that never again could a treasure of the house walk out of a locked room without a soldier's eyes to see it go. Mistress Halloran was there when I received it, and she looked at me with her closed-drawer face and said only, "You didn't fidget," which from her remained the highest praise there was. The old Queen Mother's things went home. The evening star ring went to the Princess Alara, my brightest girl. And I stood in the honor guard the day it was given to her, and I watched her put it on her right hand where Rosalind had worn it for 50 years, and I saw her turn it once in the light the way the old queen used to, and I thought the debt was paid in full. The gray pearls went to Adela's daughter Ceres, that she may remember I danced. The forget-me-not brooch went to Verena, the one honest gift, made honest at last. The private jewels went out one by one to the women whose names were written in the little brown book, each with the entry copied in the old queen's own hand, so that they received not only the jewel but the loving of it. And the great gowns, the jubilee with its silver stars, the coronation robe, the wedding gown she kept 50 years, went back to the crown's own keeping. And then, by the king's command and in fulfillment of the will that Morwenna had tried to break, into the museum of the royal house, behind glass, where the people could come and see them. I have been to see them. On my own time, out of uniform, an ordinary graying man in the slow shuffle of visitors. The blue jubilee gown stands there in a case with its little silver stars catching the museum's soft light, and there is a card beside it that tells the year she wore it and the crowd that roared, and it does not tell, how could it, that it once stood on a form in a locked cedar-scented room, while a queen who was not its owner sat among stolen ghosts in the lamplight. The people who file past it do not know. They only know that the old Queen Mother was beloved, and that her beautiful things are kept for all of them to see, the way she wished, and they look at the little stars, and some of the old ones smile as though at a face they remember. That is how it should be. That is the whole of what we were fighting for, at the door and in the corridors and in the quiet meetings behind shut doors, not the punishment of a thief, though the thief was punished, but this, that a good woman's memory should belong to the people who loved her, and not to the one who tried to lock it away and own it. Morwenna wanted the old queen for herself, in the dark, behind a door only she could open, and instead the old queen stands in the light where anyone may come forever. I went back to my post the Monday after. There was a new man to break in on the west corridor, a raw young guardsman with too much starch in his bearing, and I walked him past the door of that room, unlocked now, and empty, aired and stripped and given over to ordinary household use. And he asked me, because the young always ask, whether it was true what they said, that a whole treasure had been found hidden behind it. It's true, I told him. How was it found out, he wanted to know, after all that time? I thought about how to answer him, this boy who would spend the next years of his life learning to stand still and see nothing and ask nothing, and I gave him the only answer that was true. Someone paid attention, I said, to a gown in a corridor, that's all. A guard's whole trade is standing still and keeping quiet, but it is not the same as being blind, and it is not the same as being deaf, and the day it becomes the same, the door stays shut forever. I settled his collar for him and took up my own place at the head of the corridor, eyes forward, hands still, the way I have stood 10,000 mornings. You'll stand your post and you'll say nothing and you'll move for no one. That's the trade, and it's an honorable one. But you keep watching, lad. However long it takes. Because someday the thing you see in a corridor will be the only true account left of a wrong that no one else dares to name. And on that day, being the man who paid attention is the whole of what an honest guard is for. He straightened and squared his shoulders and turned his eyes to the front. And down the long west hall the morning light came in gray and clean through the tall windows, and fell across the floor where a queen's stolen footsteps had once gone, and I stood in it and was still, and kept my watch.